Hey, in this video, I'll show you how I replace my broken double gates.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Alright, so we're going to start by repairing this post. You can see I already kind of put some epoxy on the crack in this side. I just kind of opened it up, got some 5-minute epoxy in there, and let it dry. You can see this post is pretty well supported. It's got some metal, it's got a 2x4 in there. So when I put a patch over this, it's really just going to be cosmetic. I'm not too worried about the hinges or anything. I just kind of want to make that crack go away. I cut that little square piece of vinyl from the old gate using a table saw and a chop saw. I clamp it in place just to get some nice crispy lines, and then I cut it with a multi-tool. Clean those corners up a little bit with a utility knife. Hey, stop it. Yeah, just checking out the tape measure. That's what they all say, pal. I made sure to epoxy all 3 edges and then just dump the rest in the middle. It's definitely not perfect, but it's better than what it was. Before we can have fun and start cutting and assembling, we gotta do some math. Each gate is the size of your opening minus the space for your hinges and minus the space for your clasp. Divide this by 2, and that's the size of each gate. Be sure to check your hinges. Some only require 1 inch, some require more than 2 inches. And if you're making custom gate posts, be sure to leave yourself 1 inch on bottom and 2 inches on top. My rails are 2 inches by 6 inches. So I mark 1 inch and 7 inches. Then I find my center and mark 1 inch in each direction. Then connect the dots, and what do you know? It's probably easiest to do this with a jigsaw. You could use an angle grinder with a masonry blade or a diamond bit. You'd probably use a multi-tool. Or you can make a template and use a trim router. When using a template bit, it's best if you cut away all the excess material with a jigsaw first. If you've never used a trim router before, make sure you go in a clockwise direction and be safe. These things are incredibly dangerous. You want to keep 2 hands on the router and maybe clamp your template. Just whatever you do, be really careful. Before you cut your rails to length, check out your plastic boot and make sure they don't limit how deep your rails plug into your post. As you can see, it's not an issue for me because this boot slides in after the rail is installed. But you can see on this old gate that I just demoed, the rail bottoms out into the plastic boot. And I had to make the rails just a touch shorter, so keep this in mind when calculating your rail length. You You want your rails to be about a 1/4 inch shorter than the outside dimensions of your width. So I want 70.5, I should really cut them to 70 1/4. If you're having trouble like I am, try plugging in your saw before making a cut. Now we need to calculate how many slats we need. Plug your slats together and measure from seam to seam. My slats cover 8 3/8 inches each. Now calculate your inside dimension from post to post. My outside dimension is 70.5 minus 2 3.5 inch posts. I'm left with 63.5 inches. To figure out how many 8 3/8 slats fit into a 63.5 inch space, you can call your local mathematician. Or you can Google an inches calculator like I did. Here it says I need 7.58 pieces. And 0.58 of 8 3/8 is 4.86 inches. I'll round it down to 4 3/4. You'd rather be slightly smaller than bigger, because later our U-channels will cover the difference and give us a little allowance. The length of our U-channel will be our inside dimension from rail to rail, and my slats plug 2 1/4 into each rail, so they'll be 4.5 inches longer than the U-channel. If I can mark all my pieces without ever putting my tape or my pencil down, it goes much quicker. It had rained the night before, so I'm using a paper towel just to get the water off these slats. I don't want it splashing up into my saw. You could also see I put a little bit of cardboard pieces behind the saw. That's just to kind of contain the plastic mess. I'm going to have to sweep and vacuum it all up later, and I didn't want it going into the garden. I tried to stack my pieces in a way that I didn't have to move much, and the less walking around you do, just the faster it gets done. You don't necessarily have to use a table saw. Just if you use a circular saw, make sure you secure your piece. And also make sure you cut the tongue off of your piece and you keep the groove side. Now that all your components are cut to size, it's time for assembly. Start by plugging both rails into one post. Make sure your rail with the metal is your bottom rail and plugs into the miter with 1 inch on the end. Next, slide in your slats. The first slat should have a J channel over the groove side, and it goes against the gate post. Once all your slats are in, plug your final post over the end. It's important that you make sure at this point that your gate is tight and meets the dimensions you're looking for. In my case, I want to make sure my gate is 70.5 inches wide, then I can start screwing everything together. And before locking it in with screws, you'll want to make sure the gate is square. Measure from corner to corner and keep tweaking until both of these measurements are the same. Once you're square and meet the required dimensions, it's time to lock it all together. Some gates require a long screw through the bottom and top of that boot, and some gates require screws through the side that you cap with a plug. I'm going to screw mine from the top and bottom. Now we can install our hinges. I think it's easier to install the hinges to the fence post first, but it doesn't really matter. Just be sure to place your hinges in line with your rails so the hinge attaches to the plastic boot for added support. You'll need someone to hold the gate while you attach it to the hinges. I had to get longer screws to get through that boot, but only 2 per hinge. I use about 1.5 inches of shims right here. If the ground beneath your gates is sloped, you want to install on the higher side first, and install your second gate level with the first. Make sure your gate is hanging nice and level by adjusting the nuts on the hinges. If you're using spring wheels, be sure to preload them prior to install. It helps to use a clamp to hold it all in place. You want your gate to remain at the same height once the blocks are removed and the spring is installed. You want to install your first gate before assembling your second gate. When I measured the space after installing my first gate, I wasn't quite on track to have 3/4 inch for the clasp, so I made my second gate just a touch smaller, and it ended up working out perfectly. You can see how my 2 gates are pretty uneven. I can adjust the nut on the hinge, and then it drops down. A few more turns should do it. First, I eye up how these rods are going to work before I screw them in place. At last, the beast has been contained. Thanks for sticking around until the end. Press that like button, it'll really help me out. Subscribe to my channel to see more. See you on the next one.